So 5 days ago, thousands of Trump supporters converged on Washington, D.C. because their leader, the president, told them that the election in November was fraudulent. Of course, every court in the country has denied those claims, and yet members of the House and members of the Senate, right-wing media personalities, and people on Twitter and social media encouraged these people to show up to cause chaos. And then the president and Rudy Giuliani and a whole bunch of people who belong behind bars incited what became an act of sedition. So thousands of people broke into the Capitol building. Now, nobody has really mentioned this, but I don't think a lot of people, particularly people who don't have experience with real-world violence, and by real-world violence, I mean the kind of violence that you experience in war. See, the people that I know who have experienced real violence have called me over the last 5 days, and they've said, "Vince, do you realize how bad this could have gotten?" And I said, "Yes, I fully understand how bad Wednesday could have been." Imagine in that mob of morons and seditionists that there would have been a company-size element, say 200 former special forces or former infantrymen who were in the crowd, who had blueprints to the building, who had a plan, who were tactically sound, disciplined unit that had been training for this moment with the correct weapons and explosives to reach members of the House of Representatives, the vice president-elect, and members of the Senate. Now imagine they made their way to those members and they decided to take them hostage or perhaps execute them. There were thousands of Trump supporters chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." So Lord only knows what they would have done to the Democrats. Now let's imagine they kill half of the members who they find, including the vice president and the vice president-elect. And let's say they get on the phone with Donald Trump and they say, "Hey, we have just formed a new provisional government. We are going to get a hold of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to get a hold of the Pentagon. We're going to get a hold of every major branch of government, and we're going to let them know who's running the show now." I know people in various levels of government, various levels of the military, and various levels of police in the United States. Not one of them has told me that there is a contingency plan for what happens if a rogue paramilitary force kills half the members of Congress and, say, blows up portions of the Capitol building. Nobody has a plan for that. Anyone who thinks the government would know or that the private sector would know immediately how to respond, I think is being quite naive. And most of the people who believe that are people who have never been to a war zone or people who have never been to a failed state. So now the question is, what do we do about the seditionists? Now, people on the left are going to argue, "Oh, let's talk about free speech right now. Oh, don't crack down on them too hard because they're going to eventually crack down on us like that." These people are not serious about running a society. So anyone you hear speaking like that, understand that they have no business talking about how a nation state should operate, how a country, how a society should operate, how a quasi-democratic country should operate. Without institutions, without democratic norms, without laws and rules and regulations, what you have is complete fucking chaos. You need rules and you got to have parameters. A society of 350 million people cannot function if everyone acts as an individual. Now, I know Americans have been told for 45 years that their individual concerns and their individual wants and needs supersede that of the collective body of society. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is dead fucking wrong, and whoever told you that has been selling you a bullshit lie. This current situation has nothing to do with free speech. Free speech itself has limitations. For instance, you cannot yell fire in a movie theater. Why? Because you could very well cause many deaths by inciting something like this. Or, to use the correct term, you cannot incite violence. You cannot incite a riot. I cannot get on this video today and encourage people to do violent or riotous things. And that makes sense. If you want to live in a decent society, once again, there has to be parameters on the things you can say. Now, I would argue that there needs to be even further parameters on people who are in positions of power, particularly people who are in positions of power and have access to 14,000 or whatever it is nuclear-tipped warheads that the United States has in its arsenal, or someone who could perhaps start a war, or someone such as President Donald Trump, who at his disposal, if polling is correct, anywhere from 18 to 35% of the Republican Party agrees with what the seditionists did, which means out of 73 million voters, at least 10, 12, 13, I'm not that good at math, I apologize, or all the way up to, say, 20 to 25 million people in this country agree with what happened on Wednesday. The people who participated in Wednesday's actions should meet the full weight of the law. They should be hunted down by the FBI and a force of military, police, personnel, whoever we need to hunt down every single person who made their way into the Capitol building that day. Then they need to be tried and they need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Because to some degree, especially in the political realm, you have to make examples of people. Now, some people would argue, oh my gosh, this sounds punitive. Well, it is punitive. You see, when I was in the Marine Corps, it was clear that if one person fucked up, you could very well cause many other people's deaths. And so you as an individual were never more important than the collective body. Americans, in my opinion, need to be taught the same thing. After 45 years of pumping people's brains with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, bullshit hyper-individualism, I think it's long past time in the midst of a pandemic and a political crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen for perhaps over a century, that Americans learn the concept of collective sacrifice, the concept of the group above the individual, and the concept of civic service, service to your country. Now, much of the left, for many good reasons, has been very critical of the United States. Of course, the United States is an empire, and we have caused damage abroad. But you know, right now is not the time to discuss such things. Right now is the time to take action. Right now is the time for any decent-minded person at home to speak up, to talk to their neighbors, to get on the phone, to talk to their relatives, their cousins, their aunts, their uncles, their parents, their brothers, their sisters, co-workers, people they go to church with, people they play slow-pitch softball with. Call them. Whoever you know in your network, if you're looking at the events that have transpired in this country over the last 10 months and you think to yourself, my God, what are we going to do? Well, ordinary people have to get involved. If we allow lunatics on the right and crazy identitarians on the left, or people on the left who are not interested in running a society and a country but are simply interested in chaos, take over this country, or if no one takes over this country and it's just simply chaos because no one's organized enough to fill that void and actually take over the government and the state apparatus and administer it in a way that is as fair as possible, but also, I think, as strict as possible. Because again, we are moving into a context of climate change. We're moving into a context of great destabilization throughout the world and in this country. When there's tens of millions of climate refugees that are eventually traversing their way across the United States, we will need collective responses. We cannot have individual people or individual communities acting as they wish or in their own interests. We need to be acting in our collective interest. And speaking of collective interests, until someone can come up with a better institution than the state, than government, we have to make this government as the best government we possibly can make it. I would argue that some of the more sophisticated, accountable, disciplined, productive, and serious people that I know remain on the sidelines. Most of my veteran friends and most of the people I know who are in various government agencies today, they are not involved with the lunatics you saw on Wednesday. And in fact, they haven't been involved, say, with the left-wing protesters that people have seen over the last 9 months in this country. If these people decide to get engaged in the political process, I think people on both sides of the political spectrum will be quite shocked. I can think of a few celebrity veterans right off the top of my head that sort of fit the bill of who I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about here people like Jocko Willink, people like David Coggins, I believe is his last name, or people say like the MMA fighter Tim Kennedy. Those types of individuals do not appreciate nor do they care for what just happened on Wednesday. However, they also don't appreciate and do not care for people who want to abolish the police, abolish prisons, or say set police precincts on fire. Now, however exciting that might sound to people or whatever you may think of those actions, what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a significant sector of the American population, many of whom veterans, people who are former police officers, people who are currently in the police, people who are currently in the military, people who are in the FBI, the DEA, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the CIA, local government to some extent, who will not tolerate this type of behavior. And if those people get organized, and I in fact am encouraging people, if you are a patriot, and to me, being a patriot doesn't mean bowing down to individuals, doesn't mean taking an oath, say, to a president. It means protecting institutions. It means protecting norms, democratic norms. I would highly encourage you to get off the sidelines and to get organized. Because if we don't get organized and take this country back from the grifters in both political parties, from the fringe activists on both sides who sometimes drive the political narrative in this country, and increasingly so, and from the right-wing paramilitary forces that quite literally pose an existential threat to this country. And let me be very clear, they should be tracked down and completely wiped out. The political goal should be to completely shatter the Republican Party. We should break up every single right-wing institution in this country, and we should drive those people to the very margins of society. Anyone who supports what happened last Wednesday is a traitor to this country. And I find it ironic that the same people who called me a traitor 12 years ago when I came home and testified about war crimes in a war in Iraq that was fought based on lies, they called me a traitor. And here I was trying to explain to the American people, trying to explain to Congress what President Bush and Dick Cheney and company had led us into, and the destruction that that caused our country, the people of Iraq, and the veterans who served there. It is hard to imagine how things get calmer from here. Anyone who thinks the genie is going to go back in the bottle, or people on the left are going to move to the center, or people on the right are going to move to the center, I think is sorely mistaken. Look, the people on the right are going to continue to move further and further to the right, and the people I know on the left are going to continue to move further and further to the left. The question is, who's going to be the most reasonable people in the room? If you're a liberal watching this, I have news for you. The people who you saw on Wednesday will not make a distinction between, say, you and someone like myself who considers myself maybe, broadly speaking, a socialist. They're not going to make a distinction also for my left-wing friends. If that mob of people, that mob of seditionists on Wednesday would have gotten a hold of one of you, they wouldn't have asked if you were a liberal or if you were a socialist or if you were a communist. They would have hung you. They would have beat you to death like they beat to death that Capitol Hill police officer. People on the broad left, speaking broadly, should remember that our primary enemies are the extreme right. The left needs to stop with the circular firing squad, and people on the left need to get serious if they actually want to run society. Society is ran by institutions and social norms. And those social norms and institutions should always be improved upon, and yes, they should be critiqued. But they cannot be demolished, and they cannot be demolished overnight. So people in this country who are interested in not living in a failed state, who are interested in living in a decent, liberal, democratic, quasi-democratic, constitutional republic and a functioning society, should really think deep and hard about what they are either doing or not doing for this country.